The recently released Thomas the Tank Engine Train Sim World 5 DLC marked a return of the series to video game consoles for the first time in nearly 10 years. On top of this, we're also celebrating the 80th anniversary of the franchise this year, so I thought what better time than now to look at all of his console game releases. So today we'll be covering releases starting with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in 1993, working our way all the way up to the 3DS in 2016. We're not counting PC exclusive games today, or mobile games either, so only actual console releases. Now, before we get to our first game, if you're new around here and like Thomas the Tank Engine or other licensed tie-in games, then why not tap that subscribe button for more videos like this one. So without further ado, let's get started with our Thomas video games. So first up, we have Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, the Adventure series. Now, this is kind of a double entry on this list, as the Adventure series was actually on the SNES as well as the Sega Genesis, and both games were completely different. They just had the same name. So let's start with the Nintendo version. So the Super Nintendo Entertainment version was developed by Software Creations and published by THQ and released in 1993. The core gameplay of the Adventure series game is that it's essentially an interactive storybook that's designed to help kids learn to read. The difficulty settings for the game are determined by what age you are, and if you're over the age of 8, that's it, you're hard difficulty or nothing. Except really the only thing that hard mode does is turn off narration in the story, so you actually have to read it yourself. Anyway, the game has 3 different stories, and that is Thomas and Bertie's Great Race, Thomas Saves the Day, and Thomas, Percy, and the Mail Train. The first 2 of those stories have the option to be narrated, but the third of which is designated as a reading challenge instead, so there's no narration. However, honestly, it's better to just not have the narration because it sounds like this.
"Help me," said Thomas. "I can go faster than you."
On each page of the story, you get some nice little pictures that are somewhat interactive, and there's a couple of buttons you can press to make stuff happen in the image. Some of the images are particularly cooked. There's one that's really cursed of Percy that just terrified me. But overall, I like the idea that this was going for. So outside of the interactive stories, there are also a couple of mini-games that you can play. You've got a quiz that goes along with each story, a jigsaw puzzle, a sliding puzzle, a quite cool minigame where you have to set the points so Thomas can deliver goods to a certain station. It's pretty cool to watch. And then a racing minigame that's essentially a quick time event where you have to spam the A button to make Thomas go and beat whoever it is in a race. Now yes, it's true, there's not very much substance here in this game, but when your 3 difficulty levels range between the ages of 2 to 8 years old, we're not really the target audience here. What I will say is that I really like the menu design. The menu itself is a little interactive section where you can press on Thomas and make him go around the tracks, and interact with Percy and Bertie as well. It's a nice little touch that helps improve the overall quality of what would otherwise be a fairly average game. Now, a fun fact about this game is that there was actually an original NES prototype found for this game that was actually fully completed. It was near enough identical to this game, except it had 8-bit graphics and a new soundtrack. Thankfully, if you want to check this one out for yourself, the ROM is available online as it was never actually commercially released. Anyway, let's talk about the other adventure series for the Sega Genesis. Or, if you're like me and from the UK, the Sega Mega Drive. So the Sega version of the Adventure series, to put it bluntly, is definitely the better game. Whilst the SNES version was a charming interactive experience, this is actually a game with actual gameplay. So before you begin, you have 5 different engines that you can choose from: Thomas, James, Percy, Toby, or Duck. The main gameplay mode is just called Game, but it's essentially a mission mode where you are assigned to find the correct goods and take them to a corresponding station. Unless you're playing on easy mode, then you just find the goods and take them to any station. So you control the engines from like a top-down-ish perspective in a condensed map of the island of Sodor. The controls are fairly simple. You just push the D-pad in whichever way your engine is facing, and once you've pushed it enough, they'll keep going without you having to press it. To press the other way will slow them down, and if you come to a point, you can press in the direction of the points to change lines onto there. The quicker you finish the job, the more score you get, and if you complete it in less than a minute, you'll be congratulated by one of the engines and told that Sir Topham Hatt wants to see you, because obviously you're a really useful engine. It's a fairly cool setup with not masses of content, but a decent amount of replay value so that you can try and achieve the best possible time you can. On top of the main mode, you've also got two other gameplay experiences with the race mode, where you still have the same control scheme, but you're racing another engine, and there are obstacles that can get in your way, and the further into this you get, the more challenging it can actually be. In fact, later on through my playthrough, I struggled to win some of the races because I just couldn't react fast enough to the obstacles coming up. However, it's a very cool addition to the game, and again adds some length to it, especially because you can play through these races as all 5 of the engines. The final mode of the 3 is actually a free roam mode, where you just get to explore the island of Sodor. There's not really anything to do, you can just go around and pick up freight and drive it around. It's quite cool, and I feel like if I'd have played this when I was a kid, I would have spent hours just chugging along. Now, this version of the game was developed by Malibu Interactive and was again published by THQ, and also released in 1993. Now, interestingly enough, this game launched exclusively in America, but the cartridge was not region locked, so you could play it on different international versions of the Sega Genesis or the Mega Drive. Now, whilst we've still got some decent games coming up in this video, I would definitely say that the Sega version of the Adventure series is one of the better Thomas the Tank Engine games out there. It's a lot of fun, it's got a surprising amount of substance and a surprising amount of charm. Graphically, it looks very nice, it's very colourful. Overall, it's just a fun experience, and you should definitely check this one out for yourself. Okay, so moving on, our next game is Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Pinball. Now, yes, this was a release for computers, but it also released on the Amiga CD32, which was a games console. This game was developed and published by Alternative Software and released in 1995. There are 4 different pinball tables based around Thomas, James, Percy, or Toby. If you've ever played pinball before, then that's exactly what this is. There's not really much I can say about this game that's different compared to other pinball games, especially pinball games coming out around the same time. The tables all have a lovely, colourful, charming design, each themed around the engines, and to get higher scores, the game actually has a decent amount of challenge to it. The only other thing worth noting about Thomas Pinball is that the options menu is actually in Sir Topham Hatt's office, which I just think is a really nice touch. If you're a fan of Thomas and Pinball, then I would say this game's definitely for you. And if you want to check this one out for yourself, you can actually run this in browser on the Internet Archive website, so go and check that one out. Okay, so next up we have our first of several Japanese exclusive Thomas games. This is Kid Station Thomas the Tank Engine, or as it's known in Japan, and please forgive my pronunciation here, Kikancha Thomas to Nakamatachi. This was developed by Bandai and published by Banpresto in the year of 2000, released on the PlayStation 1. This is essentially a story-driven minigame collection, with minigames varying from puzzles, trivia, races, the standard stuff we've already seen so far. Interestingly enough, although this was a PS1 game, there was no attempt to render any kind of 3D graphics. Everything has this surprisingly nice 2D sprite work. After completing certain things, you are occasionally rewarded with a screenshot from the actual TV show as well. Except in this game, the minigames are much more fleshed out than they were in the Super Nintendo Entertainment System game. There's a lot more variety, the game is a lot longer, and it's honestly quite an entertaining game with an absolutely banging soundtrack. For a kids game, it's a decent length, it looks colourful, it looks pretty, and it's fun. What more could you possibly want? So next up we have another Japanese exclusive, and this is called the Friends of Sodor. This game was made exclusively for the Game Boy Color, developed by Tamsoft and published by them as well. It released in September of 2001. The game sees you taking control of Thomas as you explore different parts of Sodor. As you ride along the track, you will come across empty spaces where you'll have to pick the right track piece which fits where you're going. And as you continue to explore, you will encounter different Thomas characters who will give you a task, or it might be a mini game, something along those lines. The core gameplay of the Friends of Sodor is pretty much the same as it was in the Sega version of the Adventure series, just obviously simplified a little bit to fit on the Game Boy Color. The graphics are really nice. I love how vibrant and colourful this game is, and hearing the theme song in Game Boy Color form is just really charming. It sounds fantastic, and overall the game just has a really nice and charming aesthetic, even if it is very, very easy. The game features 5 different levels with some varied gameplay throughout, and interestingly enough, this is actually the first Thomas game to be released on a handheld console. Anyway, I don't have much else to say about this game, but you should definitely check this one out for yourself. It's a very cool piece of Thomas history. Okay, so next up we have the second of 2 Kids Station PS1 Thomas games. This is Kids Station Talking and Drawing with Thomas and Friends. Once again, this was developed by Bandai and published by Banpresto, releasing in 2002 exclusively for the PS1. Now, this game only works with a specific peripheral designed for the game. It has a special tablet that allows the game to be controlled with a stylus so you can draw and play other mini-games with it. So, emulating this game is a nightmare because you'll need the tablet. Now, whilst this game certainly does not look as charming as the original Kids Station PS1 game, this still has a lot going for it. You could design your own engines to race against familiar characters such as Mavis and Gordon, and there were various drawing-themed minigames such as Connect the Dots. There's also a fairly simplistic but cool looking mode where you almost get to design your own kind of Sodor, placing plants and stuff alongside the railway and then choosing which engines you want to run along there. The game does feature a fairly cooked and cursed looking pre-rendered CG cutscene at the start with Thomas, and speaking of cursed, you could also make such creations as this. The game would come packaged exclusively with the tablet, as you couldn't play this game in any other way. If you try and play this game without the tablet plugged in, you cannot get past the start menu. Again, this is another very cool piece of Thomas history, but if I had to recommend one of the 2 Kids Station games, I would definitely recommend the first. It's much more accessible, it looks nicer, and the gameplay is just overall a lot more fun. So we're now jumping forward 5 years ahead to 2007 to our next game, which is called Starts with Language, Math and English. This was once again another game only released in Japan and was exclusive to the Nintendo DS. It was developed and published by Rocket Company. Now, fun fact about me is that I don't speak or read Japanese. Now, as of so far, the Japanese exclusives that we have played, the gameplay is fairly self-explanatory and doesn't require too much reading. This is quite literally a game that's designed to teach Japanese kids, which meant that whilst playing this, I had the Google Translate app up on my phone with that camera mode that when you press a button it just translates everything it sees. It's not the world's most perfect translations, but at least I got a good idea what was actually going on. Now, when you start up the game, you're introduced to the game's really nice 2D sprite work, and has a very cool cutscene introducing some of the characters that are in the game. And I was very surprised to see Diesel 10 appear here. Once you get past this, you go to the main menu, you can select a train, and then they menacingly approach you through the screen, and then we get going. The core gameplay experience pretty much revolves around whichever train you've chosen, reaching an obstacle, and then you just have to answer a simple question, and then you move on. So, for example, it will put a Japanese word up on the screen, and you just have to select the corresponding image below, or it will be a simple equation, or a very simple English word. And that's pretty much the whole game. I don't really have much else to say about this one. The art style is nice, but outside of that, there's nothing really here, unless you happen to be a young Japanese kid who likes Thomas the Tank Engine and wants to learn. Okay, so next up we have Thomas and Friends A Day at the Races, and I don't know if you can tell by my tone, this is my least favourite game in the entire video. I cannot express how much I disliked my experience with this game. This was released in 2007, developed by Broadsword Interactive Limited, and was published by Blast Entertainment Limited for the PS2, and was exclusive to the PS2's iToy camera. So yes, you get to witness me in about 240p quality playing Thomas and Friends A Day at the Races. The game features 10 different interactive minigames that you have to wave your arms around for and interact in different, well, I say different, slightly different ways, as all the engines on the island of Sodor prepare for the famous race day. Now, as a peripheral, the iToy was actually pretty cool and definitely ahead of its time in terms of its quality, because to be honest, half of the iToy games that I've played functioned better than the Kinect did several years later. However, this isn't really one of them. The minigames kind of work, but only barely. I don't tend to record my gameplay with my microphone on, but this was one of those rare instances where I felt like I just had to because I was getting so frustrated with the game that I needed to share it with you all. This is awful. I hate it. How are you supposed to do that any f***ing faster than that? That's ridiculous. Hell. Hello? Yeah, f*** me, that one. Yes, the red one! Oh, piss off. This game is shit. The minigames can vary from painting the engines to loading coal into trucks and matching faces. It's really nothing special. At the end of each minigame that you pass, the game asks you to take a photo, so instead of putting in words my overall thoughts for this game, here's the picture I took. And on that terrible disappointment, let's move on. So next up we have Thomas the Tank Engine Intellectual Educational Learning for DS. This was developed and published by Rocket Company, obviously for the DS, in 2008. Now, I may be described as many things, but an intellectual is certainly not one of them, and thankfully you don't need to be one to play this game. Now, whilst the previous Rocket Company DS game had a much heavier emphasis on learning language and math, this game is more of a mini-game collection with a mild emphasis on brain training, I guess would be the best way to word that. There's memory games and such things like that, but there's nothing really like the previous game. Once again, the game opens with a very nice 2D cutscene, which is pretty much just the same as the previous game, except the trains are moving in a different direction. It then cuts to this fairly impressive 3D rendered models of engines, and they actually don't look too bad. You then choose one of the 6 rendered engines. You've got Thomas, Gordon, James, Percy, Toby, and Duck, and each one will take you to a different location, and then there's a few interactive bits and 2 minigames per section. On top of this, this game also features gacha collectibles, which I just thought was hilarious. In one area you have Cranky, the crane, acting as a grabber machine, and in another area there's literally just a Thomas the Tank Engine slot machine, and I just find that so funny. The minigames are quite varied, again ranging from memory games, to a game where you have to bash trucks away for points, to a game where you have to clear the line for Gordon. There's one where engines drive past quickly through some trees and you have to identify which one's which. Honestly, it's a pretty good time. This is another game I'd absolutely recommend if you can read and understand what's going on. So next up we have another dual release, and this is Thomas and Friends Hero of the Rails. This is a minigame collection that follows the story of the special of the same name. It was developed by Silver Ball Studios and published by Barnstorm Games. It was planned to be published by Majesco Entertainment in America, but for unknown reasons this version was scrapped, meaning this game only released in Europe. It was on both the Wii and the DS and released on the 20th of August 2010. Now, in terms of gameplay, you have 8 different minigame types here. You've got painting and washing. Both of these are pretty much identical in how they work. You either use the touchscreen to wipe or paint over the engine, or you use the motion controls with the Wii remote. Then you've got racing, which on the touchscreen you spin the wheel on the screen to make the engine go faster, or if you're using a Wii remote you just move it in a circular motion. Then you've got a minigame where you sort parts. You've got a shunting minigame where you have to push a truck into a specific place. There's a snap game where you press A when 2 of the same cards are appearing on the screen. And finally, you have a fixing minigame where you fix Hero. You drag the part onto him and then move either your touchscreen stylus or the Wii remote around to weld it on. Both versions of this game are practically identical and only differ in how they are actually played. They're both incredibly bare-boned and is only to be enjoyed by those of very young age. In fact, you can pretty much finish this game in like an hour. I did the first 4 chapters in what was probably about 15 minutes. So there definitely isn't very much content here for the amount that you would have paid for the game. Overall, this is just very average and I couldn't recommend this at all. Okay, so next up we just have another brief entry for the Nintendo DS. This was another Japanese exclusive called Chara Pasha Kikansha Thomas. This was more of a DSIware bit of software rather than a full game. It's literally just a bit of software that allows you to take pictures with the DSi camera with Thomas the Tank Engine themed frames. Sadly, this was delisted many years ago. There's basically nothing about this online aside from a couple of screenshots and the icon that was used on the DS menu, but there's not really any game there to discuss anyway. If you want to read more about this bit of software, then just hop on over to delistedgames.com, as there's a bit more about it there. So we are now entering the final era of this video, which was the Thomas & Friends 3DS era, which had 3 separate releases from 2014 to 2016. The first of these is the Japanese exclusive Thomas educational game, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, so for the sake of argument we'll call this Thomas ABC. This game was developed and published by Nippon Columbia and released on July 31st, 2014. In terms of gameplay, this is pretty much identical to the Rocket Company developed DS game Start with Language, Math and English. You get shown a Japanese word, you select the corresponding image that matches it, you get shown several of one item and you have to count it and choose how many there are. It's a very simple learning tool with a Thomas & Friends paint job. Visually, it's a cool looking game, but outside of this, there's not really much else to say about it. So next up we have Steaming Around Sodor. This was developed by Taurus Games, published by Avonquest Software and released on the 2nd of October 2015. This was released exclusively in Europe, but even more exclusively than that, only 5 countries: the UK, Ireland, Spain, Germany and the Netherlands. It has a very simple story that sees Thomas and friends preparing for some important visitors, the Duke and Duchess of Boxford. And to prepare for their arrival, you are going to complete some of the most boring minigames I've ever played in my entire life. The biggest problem with the minigames in Steaming Around Sodor is that instead of being on a time limit, most of them are life-based, which in itself isn't a problem, but because the minigames are so easy, and even as you get later on into them, they don't really get any harder, the only way that I found I could get out of playing them was to just let myself lose, and then it would just come up saying well done anyway. There are a couple of exceptions with minigames having a time limit, but for the most part they don't. Minigames can consist of a match 3 game, there's a game where you have to tap on the engines to stop them coming out of the shed, and there's a minigame where there's balls bouncing off of a bridge and Thomas has to bounce them safely along into a truck. All very exciting stuff. Overall, this game just isn't very good, with a very boring story, very uninspired minigames that go on for way too long, and outside of this, absolutely nothing else going on. There's zero replay value here because most of the minigames are so easy, there's no success in getting a high score, you feel no sense of accomplishment because what you've done is so unbelievably easy, it's not worth celebrating. And that takes us to our final Thomas & Friends console release. This is Railroad Nippon Let's Run the Oigawa Railway on Thomas Line, which is a rough translation of the Japanese title. This was developed and published by Sonic Powered and released on July 28, 2016, and the following year would release on the 3DS eShop on the 22nd of March. This is a very simplistic train simulator and is part of a series known as the Japanese Rail Sim 3D series here in the West. The gameplay sees you driving Thomas, with Hero guiding you as to when to stop and to pull your whistle. It's simple but effective, and for me basically just felt like a day out with Thomas the game, which is what the new Train Sim World 5 Thomas DLC was going for. However, what that DLC did not include was, of course, collectible cards and gacha mechanics, which this game does have, because of course it does. Overall though, this is a pretty good game. Yes, it's simple, yes, there's not much else to do outside of this, but it's pretty fun, and that's what matters. It's certainly a weird game to end Thomas's console run on, but I'm just glad it exists. So that takes us to the end of all of our Thomas and Friends console video games. What do you guys think of these games? Do you have a favourite? And do you have a least favourite? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications of my future uploads, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.